There's nothing quite like a bowl of hearty beef barley soup on a cold day. It is cozy, it is wholesome, and it feels like a warm hug in a bowl. Today we're making a classic beef barley soup filled with tender beef, perfectly cooked barley with rich and comforting flavors. We'll make it step by step on the stovetop, but I will also share tips for making it in a slow cooker. The best part, this soup freezes beautifully, so you can make a batch, eat some right away, and freeze the leftovers for later whenever you need a little comfort. So, without further ado, let's make some beef barley soup. Let's start with the ingredients. As the name suggests, the two main stars of the soup are beef and barley. First up, the beef. When it comes to choosing beef for the soup, you have a few options, depending on your time and preference. The first option, and the one we're using today, is chuck roast. Chuck roast is a favorite for soups and stews because it is from the shoulder area of the cow, which has a lot of connective tissue. This cut is perfect for long cooking times as the connective tissue breaks down slowly, making the beef incredibly tender and flavorful. If chuck roast isn't available, boneless short ribs, beef shank, or even brisket would work well in the soup. Just make sure they're cut into small pieces for even cooking. I like to buy a 2-pound piece and cut it myself into 1/2 inch cubes. I know this might be a bit controversial, but here's why I prefer cutting my own beef. Those pre-cut stew meat packages you see at the store are usually just a mix of random scraps from different cuts. This means the pieces can cook differently. Some might get perfectly tender, while others stay tough and chewy. And in a soup like this, you want every bite to be equally delicious. So I think it's worth getting a whole piece like a chuck roast and cutting it yourself. It's a little extra effort, but I think it makes a big difference. Our second option, though less traditional, is ground beef. As I was working on this recipe, I came across some recipes where this version is called hamburger barley soup. It's a great option if you're short on time because you can skip the whole searing step. Instead, you just saute the ground beef, which is a bit faster but still gives you a flavorful soup. Finally, you can use already cooked beef, which is perfect if you have leftovers like roast beef, pot roast, brisket, or even steak. This is another time saver as you can skip the browning step. If you go this route, make sure to cut the beef into small cubes or shred it, especially like for brisket, so it mixes nicely into the soup and absorbs all the flavor. Obviously, each of these options has its benefits, but for the best texture and flavor and more of a classic beef barley soup, chuck roast is my go-to. Let's move on to the second star of the show, barley. We're using pearl barley, which is the most common type you'll find in stores. When you're shopping for it, look for the label pearl barley, which means that the outer bran layer has been removed, so it cooks up soft and tender, perfect for soups like this. You might also see hulled barley on the shelves. That version still has the outer hull, making it a bit firmer and darker in color. But keep in mind, hulled barley takes much longer to cook, which is why pearl barley is better choice here. It is quick, easy to work with, and gives you that perfect hearty texture. Moving on. Now that we covered the two most important ingredients, let's get cooking. We'll start by cutting our chuck roast into small cubes. Now, I'm intentionally starting with the beef because we don't want the meat to be super cold. While we work on the rest of the ingredients, meaning chopping a bunch of vegetables, we'll let it come closer to room temperature, which helps it sear better and brown more evenly. The size of the cubes is a personal preference. For a soup like this, I prefer smaller cubes around 1/2 inch. Not only do they cook more evenly and sear faster, but smaller pieces also mean you'll get a bite of tender beef in every spoonful, which is exactly what we want in a hearty soup like this. In contrast, if I were making a stew, I'd go for larger cubes, closer to say like 1 inch, since they hold up nicely in a thicker dish. Still, it's a personal preference. Next, we'll pat dry the beef with paper towels. This step is key because drying the meat helps it sear properly and develop that brown crust we all love. We'll also season it with 1 teaspoon of kosher salt and 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper, making sure every piece gets coated, which will help us lock in flavor right from the start. Next, we'll grab a large pot such as this 6-quart Dutch oven or any other heavy bottom pot and heat a tablespoon of vegetable oil such as olive oil or avocado oil, whichever one you have, until it is shimmering hot. This is an important step step in that hot surface will help us brown the meat quickly without it releasing all of its juices. Since we're using a large Dutch oven with rather large surface area and the beef is cut into small pieces, we can add all the meat at once. We'll spread it out in an even layer as much as possible. Then we'll let it cook undisturbed for a minute or two before stirring, which gives it that chance to brown. Depending on the cut, the beef might release some juices, and that's okay. As they cook, we'll stir it frequently until the meat is browned on all sides, which should take about 6 to 8 minutes. We'll transfer the meat to a large platter with all the juices, cover it with foil or if you have a lid like mine, and set it aside. On to cooking the vegetables. Using the same pot, we'll add 1 large diced onion, 3 sliced carrots, and 2 stalks of sliced celery. We'll cook them over medium-high heat, stirring frequently for about 10 minutes or until they've softened and started to release some of their natural sweetness. As you saw, I didn't use oil as my meat was pretty marbled, meaning it had a good amount of fat on it, and some of that fat was already at the bottom, but if you feel like you need it, feel free to use a tablespoon of olive oil to saute your vegetables. Now, going back to vegetables, while I'm using the classic combo of onion, carrots, and celery, you can absolutely switch things up. This soup is meant to be hearty and full of veggies, so feel free to make it your own. When it comes to vegetables, parsnips, turnips, mushrooms, or leeks would all be delicious additions. And if you want to sneak in some greens, you can stir a handful of baby spinach or even kale at the very end. It's not traditional, but it works beautifully. The beauty of a soup like this is that you can work with what you have on hand and make it truly yours. Next, we'll add 4 minced garlic cloves to the pot and saute them for about 30 seconds, just until they're fragrant. Garlic cooks quickly, so keep an eye on it. We don't want it to burn. Then we'll stir in 3 tablespoons of tomato paste along with 1 teaspoon of salt and half a teaspoon of black pepper. Cook that mixture, stirring constantly for about a minute. This step helps the tomato paste caramelize a bit, deepening its flavor and giving our soup a rich and savory base. We'll stir in half a cup of red wine and scrape up all those flavorful brown bits from the bottom of the pot using a wooden spoon. Those little bits are packed with flavor and will give the soup an extra depth. Next, we'll add the brown beef, including any juices that collected on the plate, 7 cups of beef broth, a 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes, and 3 to 4 sprigs of fresh thyme tied together with kitchen twine. And we'll give it a good stir to combine. Here's a little tip. Instead of leaving the pot uncovered, we'll place the lid on, but slightly ajar. This helps the soup cook faster without losing too much liquid, which I think is a common issue in most beef barley soup recipes. When too much liquid evaporates, you end up with a soup that is thicker than it should be. Sure, we could add more broth or water, but that would dilute all those flavors we worked so hard to build. By keeping the lid ajar, we preserve the rich flavor while controlling the evaporation. The downside is that you'll need to keep an eye on it, stir frequently, and adjust the heat as needed to keep things simmering gently. Once it's boiling, we'll turn the heat down to medium-low and let it simmer for 30 to 45 minutes or until the meat is fully cooked and tender. Next, we'll stir in 1 cup of pearl barley and 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce. Let the soup continue simmer with the lid slightly ajar for another 45 to 55 minutes. Keep a close eye on it, stirring every 10 minutes until the barley is tender but still has a slight bite to it. Also keep in mind that barley will absorb some of the liquid, thickening the soup just enough to make it hearty and comforting. Once the soup is done simmering, turn the heat off and remove the thyme bundle. Though it's optional, at this point I like to stir in 1 to 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. The vinegar brightens up the flavors and adds a subtle tang that balances the richness of the beef and barley. I think it's a small touch that can make a big difference, giving the soup a more well-rounded taste. Still, like I said, it's optional. At this point, it's also a good idea to give it a taste and add more seasoning if necessary. We'll finish it off with a half a cup of chopped fresh parsley for a pop of color and some freshness. We'll give that one last stir and voila, just like that, it is ready to serve. We'll ladle it into a soup bowl and garnish it with more chopped parsley. Serve it with some crusty bread on the side and a glass of red wine if you want to treat yourself. Before we wrap up, a couple of helpful things. 1. Consistency of the soup. As the soup simmers and the barley cooks, you might notice the liquid reducing quite a bit. This is totally normal, but it does take a bit of a juggling act to keep it simmering at the right level and adjust the liquid as needed. The thickness or the consistency is really a personal preference. If you feel like it's getting too thick, it's perfectly fine to move the pot to a lighter heat on the stove and add more water or broth. Just make sure you're adding warm water or broth to keep the soup's temperature consistent and avoid interrupting the cooking process. 2. Check the packaging. While I listed the cooking time for barley as like 45 to 55 minutes, keep in mind that the different brands may vary slightly in their cooking times. It is unlikely to be a big difference, but it's always a good idea to check the packaging for guidance. This way, you'll have a better sense of when to check for that perfect, tender, yet chewy texture. 3. Making it in slow cooker. The stovetop method takes about 2.5 to 3 hours from start to finish, and while it's totally worth it, it does require some tending throughout the process. If you're looking for a more hands-off approach or want to make it ahead, you can absolutely cook the soup on slow cooker. The process starts in the same way, meaning you sear the meat, set it aside, saute the vegetables, and cook the wine while scraping up those brown bits. And once done, you can store the meat and veggies separately in an airtight container in the fridge overnight. In the morning, transfer everything to a slow cooker along with the rest of the ingredients. You can cook it on low for 7 to 9 hours or on high for 4 to 5 hours until the meat is tender. If you can, I recommend stirring it a few times during the process. And just like with the stovetop version, stir in the apple cider and parsley right before serving. 4. Making it ahead, storing and freezing leftovers. It goes without saying that soups and stew like this taste even better the next day as the flavors develop and melt. That's why it's always a good idea to make it a day ahead if you can. Leftovers can be stored in airtight containers in the fridge for up to 4 days. Just make sure to let the soup cool to room temperature before transferring it to containers. If you'd like to freeze it, use freezer-friendly containers and it will keep well for up to 3 months. Again, make sure the soup is cooled to room temperature before freezing. When you're ready to enjoy it, thaw it overnight in the fridge for the best texture and flavor. And lastly, reheating. To reheat, transfer the soup to a saucepan. Keep in mind that it tends to thicken as it sits, so adding a cup or so of water or beef broth can help bring it back to the right consistency. Give it a good stir and warm it over medium heat until it is heated through. Then it's ready to serve. There you have it, friends. A classic cold weather soup that is hearty, comforting, and packed with flavor. Whether you make it on the stovetop, in a slow cooker, or ahead of time, it is the kind of recipe that brings everyone to the table. You can find the printable recipe on my website, foolproofliving.com. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. It in a slow cooker. Dang it. Worcester, like a choke roast. Choke roast. That did not sound right. This one was not filming. Dang it, man. Worcester sauce. Worcestershire sauce. Okay.